This is Space Minds by Space News. In this week's episode of Space Minds, host David Ariosto speaks with Terry Hart, former NASA astronaut and mission specialist on the Space Shuttle Challenger. Hart reflects on the triumphs of early shuttle missions, the lessons of the Challenger tragedy, and how those experiences shape today's commercial space era, led by companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin.
Terry Hart, it is really good to see you again.
Thank you, David. Good to see you.
Yeah. So let's get a little bit of context here. So you're a former astronaut, former mission specialist on Challenger. You operated the IMAX camera for the feature The Dream is Alive, that which sort of helped deploy that long duration exposure facility back in '84.
Yeah.
That before we get into everything else, I think sometimes that's almost overlooked in the context of how big of a deal that was in terms of like the first long-term real exposure for real exposure data in terms of the harsh environment of LEO and this large like unmanned free-flying spacecraft that can kind of do these long-term experiments and the value of them. But when I say Challenger, I don't think people think of that.
Yeah.
Admittedly so, right? And
Yeah.
so they think of what happened 2 years later, like
Mhm.
73 seconds after launch, January 28th, 1986, and the loss of life that happened in large part by that the failure of that rubber O-ring on the solid rocket fuel booster, which sort of failed in the cold weather.
Yeah.
And just as an aside, I mean, I remember myself being in grade school
Mm.
and like a lot of kids across the country because there was this first school teacher, Krista McCullough,
Mm.
and teachers all around the country had switched their TVs on for that sort of like countdown. And in January, we don't usually do anniversaries, right? But in January it'll be 40 years. And it seems like one of those moments in the nation's history, JFK assassination,
Yeah.
9/11,
Mm.
Challenger,
Mm.
and then years later Columbia. And
Mm.
and and so, this seemed different in terms of like what we had known as a country at the time in terms of our spaceflight program. And you were part of that astronaut corps, and you knew Dick Scobie, and who's commanding the Space Shuttle Challenger, and I wonder if you can just maybe start us off by painting a little bit of a picture in terms of what that era was like, what that group was like, and and
Yeah.
and the folks that were part of that mission.
Sure. Yeah, it was a national, tragedy, of course, especially with Krista McAuliffe, on board. So yeah, Dick Scobie was actually the pilot on my mission. So we flew together on the fifth flight of Challenger. Then this was his first flight as the commander on the 10th flight of Challenger. It was the 25th flight, I think, of the program. And Mike Smith, his pilot, was my best friend there. And yeah, so it was a hard day for everybody. And I think most of us close to the program, David, we figured at some point, you're likely to lose one. I mean, it's a dangerous business. Spacecraft fly about 100 times faster than an airplane, and the energy involved goes with the square, of the velocity. So in other words, there's 10,000 times more energy to get a spacecraft into Earth orbit than to take off an airplane. And just the physics of the situation is always going to be dangerous there. So we figured maybe something, turbine blade comes off or something, and we're going to lose a vehicle. But to lose one with a problem that was well known, but not shared, across the program was really disheartening. And a lot of us, felt that we certainly should not have lost that one. And I think similar feelings about Columbia as well.
Yeah.
That there were things leading up to that were clear indicators of problems that probably should have been given more attention.
I think it was also this sense that some of these launches were no longer carried by the major media companies. I
Yeah,
mean, you had
yeah,
that. I mean, you had that even during the Apollo era, right?
right,
And which is just remarkable. Some of these
right.
the criticisms of making the moon landing look humdrum in some
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
And there was almost like this sense that pervaded the nation in some extent that this was just akin to commercial air travel.
yeah, but
And
it's not.
right, right.
Yeah,
And I just, I guess so let's start there. Like in terms of, how it changed public perception and
Mhm.
maybe the echoes of that as we kind of look forward into this new era.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because it's human nature. Once things start to look like they're routine, we take our mind off it a little bit, and it's a challenge. I mean, you need two things to run a really safe, high risk kind of program like the space program will always be. You need leadership, David. And we had it in spades, at NASA. People like Chris Kraft and Gene Kranz, the famous guys that I got to know pretty well, during the shuttle program. They kept their foot on the pedal with safety and quality, and they didn't let anyone forget it. And that can be hard to do. It's easy to say it, but it's hard to walk the talk because you get budget pressures, and in the case of Challenger, it clearly was schedule pressures that started to erode those particular leaders in Huntsville. So it's hard. It's much harder to do than it is to say. But those kind of people like Chris and Gene, they really knew how to keep the organization focused, on quality and safety. And then you need a sense of teamwork, among all the people working under them, so that they get the message, of course, but they also work together in a way to make that happen, so that you don't cover up problems. When things go wrong, you share them. And in this particular case, a Challenger, Huntsville, the Marshall Space Flight Center was not sharing that stuff, with Houston. The program didn't even know there was a problem, with the SEALs. And that's terrible. So you need those two things: the leadership and the teamwork below it. And even then, you can still have that bolt out of the blue. We still lose airplanes, of course.
Sure.
In space, like I said, it's 100 times harder, 10,000 times harder.
Yeah, I mean, it's harder. There are more challenges in terms of, long-term, even long-term problems in terms of radiation exposure and
Yeah.
micrometeor strikes and
Mhm.
the increased,
Mhm.
problem with space debris.
Yeah.
And all of these things are, well, especially the last one seems to be increasing. But
Mhm.
I wonder now if you to kind of relate some of those experiences to kind of where it's shaping up now in terms of the industry, because space development, space commercialization, space exploration, like there's a
Yeah.
whole host of new commercial players, SpaceX, Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, all these major players are in many ways taking the lead. And I've heard it referred to in some respects that NASA has sort of transitioned a little bit in terms of its
Mhm.
role as a principal architect to that of more of a sort of client of some of these, leading
Mhm.
companies.
Mhm.
But I wonder where the operational DNA lies in
Mhm.
companies that may have different pressures. I mean, there's always budgetary concerns, and
Right.
those always exist.
Mhm.
But in the commercial space, it's a little bit different when you have like the nature of domestic competition vying against each other,
Mhm.
and the
Mhm.
push to be first, and the push to kind of get the launch cadence up, and I wonder where the lessons of Challenger fit into this.
Yeah, it's a good thing to think about. I mean, the executives in these new private businesses that are doing more and more in space now need to be thinking about that, especially when human uh,
Yeah.
flight is a part of their portfolio. And I think they are. I mean, all indications right now, the transition's actually going pretty well. I was a little skeptical when, back when NASA decided to shut down the shuttle program and turn it over to SpaceX.
Were
We
you?
had
Were
that
you? Were
gap.
you one of the skeptics?
I'm sorry.
Were you one of these skeptics in
Yeah, I
terms
was
of?
skeptical. Yeah, and I was concerned. And we did have a hiatus there where we only could get to the space station, with the Russian Soyuz, which was unfortunate. But the progress that SpaceX particularly made, was pretty impressive, and it continues to be impressive. And I think the focus on safety, I hope it is. I'm not inside. A lot of my former students are working there now, but
Yeah.
I think hopefully the culture has been. Part of the safety culture is part of it, and now of course profit, like you were suggesting, is also a motive. But that kind of reinforces it, And Boeing and Airbus, they all
Yeah.
focus on safety on their airplanes because you're not going to sell airplanes, if you start to have technical problems. And the same thing, SpaceX and Blue Origin coming along here now, they need to focus on safety, particularly when humans are on board, and then to of course, maintain their business reputation, with that kind of focus.
Yeah, I mean that's the difference, right? I mean we've seen a lot of success in the launch market on the commercial side.
Mhm.
But what the shuttle flew like 135 missions, something to that effect. I
Yeah,
mean,
35 or 36, somewhere around there. Yeah.
yeah. And in terms of manned, not suborbital, but manned orbital flights, I don't know that the numbers like even fraction of that. I like maybe 15 or so, something to that effect. So
From SpaceX, you mean with the Dragon?
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I think it's in maybe 20 or something. Yeah, they're starting to build up a very
sure,
impressive record. Yeah, yeah.
sure. But I guess my point being is that, in the context of a numbers game, in the context of like, questions about space, and I've,
Mhm.
I've interviewed other astronauts who say,
Mhm.
these things happen. This is not a
Mhm.
question of if, this is a
Yeah.
when.
Mhm.
And, if a Challenger like disaster happened today,
Mhm.
um, I wonder, like, how would it affect public perception? How would it affect
Mhm.
legislatures? How would it affect sort of the
Mhm.
groundswell of change that we saw not only after Challenger, but certainly with Columbia, the cancellation of Constellation, and the ripple
Mhm.
effects these necessarily have, and in terms of maybe a public that asks, why are we doing this? Why are we going to space?
Yeah.
Why are we
Yeah.
exploring? It's the
Mhm.
one thing in the context of commercial endeavors. You can see sort of the profit-driven motive of
Mhm.
companies that operate in low Earth orbit. But when you think about pure science or pure
Mhm.
exploration, um, and the nature of the risks, like how do you balance that? How do you balance the need for safety and the maintenance of that public support, and also not stop pushing the technological boundaries that it
Mhm.
has to be a part of that almost bravery that's associated with space?
Yeah, I think in our nature, our human nature, we want to explore. I don't think that's going to go away. I think we're always going to have that spark, and it's an important spark too, because a lot of people vicariously share in that. We can't all go. We can't all go to Mars or back to the moon. But we all share in the experience. And for the young people, particularly, that's a real exciting thing. I mean, the students that come here to Lehigh, for aerospace engineering, they have a
You say
passion.
you're a professor there at Lehigh. We haven't
Yeah,
mentioned.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that passion, comes from when they were 5 years old, they saw something happen on TV, that was exciting in space, and that gave them that continuing, focus to want to get the education, when they come here. And I see it every day, they're that way. And others are passionate about airplanes,
Yeah.
it's a mix, but yeah, so we're going to have that. So we have to, balance that, of course, with the risk. And again, that comes to that leadership thing I was talking about earlier. You need people that are making the decisions, and they need to include the astronaut office, and they do. The people that are going to go to the moon and go to Mars someday. Maybe the individual astronauts that go might not be part of the decision to launch the program, to fund the program. But the current group in the astronaut office are, and they can help make that decision on where to draw that line, on risk, because you can't get rid of it. It's not going to go away, but you can certainly do everything reasonable, to retire as much risk as possible. And then you just have at that point, you have to run the program and not compromise because of budget or schedule. You have to
Right.
maintain your foot on the pedal of safety there.
I wonder if you can take what you just said and then kind
Mhm.
of relate it in terms of this broader sort of paradigm, in the
Mhm.
sense that I've heard it described to me as this, is that they like this lean on commercial companies, the private sector is part of an effort that both NASA and Washington at large is using in terms of the geopolitical competition and
Mhm.
the nature of defense and the race to the moon that we're starting to see,
Yeah.
in bigger earnest and greater earnest with China.
Mhm.
And you see the CLIPS program that it's meant to kind of kickstart the beginnings of infrastructure on the lunar
Mhm.
surface, and
Mhm.
Artemis.
Mhm.
But you know, traditionally, or at least like the driving mindset is in recent years has been commercial sector operates, at a profit margin, low Earth orbit. Maybe it
Mhm.
kind of gets you to the moon in some sort of like beginning capacity. And what we've seen just with the transition, Artemis being sort of opened up in terms of commercial competition, is maybe
Mhm.
emblematic of that. But the big stuff, like the long
Mm,
distance, exploratory nations, that's more the purview of NASA and
right.
others.
Mhm.
And then I wonder when you think about the initiatives that SpaceX is taking with regard to Mars. You look at what
Mhm.
Peter Beck is doing in terms of exploratory efforts with Venus.
Mhm. Yeah.
I don't know if that argument holds true as much anymore in terms of like commercial is pushing beyond what the initial profit margin is in terms of LEO and really looking elsewhere. And how do you feel about that? How do you feel about the purview of our exploratory efforts not being under the rubric of a nationalized effort, and more that of a sort of a clientized model. I
Yeah,
just
it's interesting that I would not have predicted that drift would have happened.
Yeah.
But even if you go back to 20, 30 years ago, we started to see technical innovations were under DoD funding, so breakthroughs in things. And then as the years went on, all of a sudden, the DoD was buying high definition television. The stuff that was done commercially now was coming in to the DoD without having them to spend the money. So I think something similar is probably going on here now that these really large companies like SpaceX that and Elon Musk with a passion to go to Mars, he's willing to contribute to that. I don't think that can be self-sustaining though in the broader sense. I think you still need the government to come in and have NASA do the hard stuff, like if you're going to develop new kind of propulsion system in space or nuclear reactors in space or helium-3 on the moon or the really the stuff where there's no obvious business model with revenue in the near term for a corporation. That's the stuff that NASA's got to do. Otherwise it won't get done. And we won't get there. I think your point's well taken. Though the fact that someone like SpaceX could actually be funding part of a future mission to Mars, just because the CEO wants to do that, it is a new page in our evolution, technically.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, I don't know that there is a private company out there that's creating their own James Webb Space Telescope,
Right.
in that context. So like there's there's a lighthouse effect maybe in terms of how we view these things. But
Mhm.
you mentioned television, so like that might be a perfect segue in terms of what you did on Challenger. I mean, you operated this IMAX camera on your mission. And I just gotta ask you. I mean, for those who haven't seen, The Dream is Alive. It's one of those kind of seminal things. But what was that like? What was that like capturing that? Not only in terms of what you were doing and what you were seeing, but like
Mhm.
knowing that you're doing this for a much bigger audience on
Mhm.
Earth.
Yeah. Yeah, we were the first crew to fly the camera, so it was a nice experience to train. And I got to know Graham Ferguson very well, the developer of the camera, the head of IMAX up in Toronto there. And it was interesting because almost everything we train in to do in space, it's harder to do in space than it is on the ground. So we have to find ways to make it similar. We have to go underwater or whatever. The IMAX camera was kind of just the opposite because the problem was a big, heavy camera and the film was in canisters about a foot in diameter, and it's a 75 millimeter format, so it's real wide format, and they're heavy, So and you had to change the film out with the camera inside a black bag.
Yeah.
So you had to go in the black bag. It would cover your
Right.
arms so no light would seep in, and then you would have to take
The
the
old
film.
dark room thing in space, essentially. Yeah.
Exactly. You'd have to take it out. And on the ground, that was really hard. I mean, Crippen and I were the two that operated the camera, were trained to operate it. And we had to kind of help each other on the ground. But we found out, once we got in space, we're weightless. It wasn't a piece of cake. It was much easier than it was on the ground because you didn't have to worry about the camera falling or whatever, as you were floating around.
Yeah. I mean, and just, I mean, you think about it, that was more than 40 years ago. Challenger was more than 40 years ago. And now we're talking about moon bases and Mars and
Yeah.
James Webb that's staring back into the early dawn of the universe. And I just like, I wonder like what that says to you about sort of the future of future of operation I use these words very specifically, operation in space
Mhm.
and human operation in space,
Mm. Yeah.
and maybe the divide between the two and the future of human spaceflight, and really, like it is this kind of this new golden age that we're entering now, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think a lot of people that are thinking about future programs in space and how technology is going to evolve are really lighting on AI, like everybody is, that we
Yeah.
can do so much. I mean, you talk about Mars, going to Mars, the speed of light, it could be 20, 30, 40 minutes round trip to
Right.
send a signal, so obviously you're not going to do real-time operations once you leave that far from Earth. So we need people or AI to kind of look at things and make decisions in real time. Um, but even closer, I think that a lot of hope for making space more accessible and being able to do more, with AI and other new technologies. So it's really an exciting time. There's a threshold we're crossing here now, I think, in as you said, operations in space, where we're going to be much more capable, than we've been servicing satellites and all those kind of things.
Well, we talk about accessibility, right? Do you think, harkening back to what we were originally talking about at the very beginning of this conversation in terms of like the humdrum nature of it and the comparisons to commercial spaceflight, do you think we will get to a place at some point where that analogy between commercial aviation and spaceflight is more succinct, more accurate?
I think gradually, again, the physics are just so much different. The energy levels to get into space, and that's just the nature, the beast here, and we're not going to change that. Maybe we can make propulsion systems, safer and more efficient and reusable and all those kind of good things. But still, it's always going to be a little different than airplanes. For that reason. But having said that, I mean, there's no reason we can't we will continue to expand our technical capabilities and do all kinds of things with a moon base on the South Pole and take advantage of learning how to live in space as we start to move out beyond the moon.
Well, it's also interesting in the context of that in terms of public perception because you
Mm.
no longer have that sort of captured audience, like the three big networks and people just sort of having something to kind of gather around at night in terms of a viewing a viewing experience, or frankly, like I did, many school children did in school when they
Mhm.
watched Challenger.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you were to take that experience of when you were watching, um,
Mhm.
and knowing the risks and knowing the value of exploration
Mhm.
and this sort of ill-defined concept of progress, that is, somewhat subjective in terms of how you
Mhm.
how you look at it. But I mean, what do you say to your students when you think about this and the value of exploration and like where this takes us, and knowing that at some point there will be other people who will likely die in space.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think we focus on the positive, obviously, but we have in the back of our mind all the time, the risk and just trying to retire that. My student, well, I think when you're younger, when I signed on to be an astronaut, like all other astronaut candidates that came into NASA, we understand the risk and say, okay, I'm going to accept that. The excitement of being part of this exploration and all is well worth it. And
Yeah.
then you spend the rest of your time in training, trying to minimize that risk as much as possible and make the mission successful and all that goes with that. So in my students, I think they're just naturally optimistic that way. So it's not something I have to sell to them, and they're eager to get out there and make it happen, either as engineers or as astronauts.
That's the
And
interesting thing about space, isn't it? That is inherently optimistic, not only because of the nature of the infinite possibilities out there, but
Mhm.
one of my experiences, like you know, as a journalist and kind of going in and out of factories being at launches, that like there's this real sense of camaraderie between motley crews of aerospace engineers and machinists and physicists,
Mhm.
individuals that don't necessarily look like they'd inhabit the same space. The guys with the tattoos on the neck, next to physicists who are neck deep in the books. So it's just you know I think covering this and paying attention to it and teaching this as you do,
Mhm.
you want to capture that sense of optimism,
Mhm.
um, but you also sort of do it in this sort of acknowledgement of the dangers are up there, which you know just about as well as anybody. But I wonder where this takes us as like this shifts out of the purview of purely nationalistic endeavors,
Mhm.
has a commercial sector that's increasingly more aggressive. You have more people operating up there. You have more risks as associated with that. And this new era is just I don't know. It's just like there's a big question mark in terms of what comes next. I mean, would you agree with that?
Well, that's part of the excitement. My opening lecture to my students in the junior introduction course, I go through in about an hour, probably about 60 charts about the 100 years since the Wright brothers flew, you know,
Oh, the
and
pace is
you,
alarmingly fast, right? And it'll get more so
yeah,
with AI and quantum and all these other things that
yeah, we're only accelerating, but if you just look
right.
at that 100 years, I mean, Orville and Wilbur would be blown out of the water, by everything that happened during that time. So I step them through that, through
Yeah.
Charles Lindbergh, and then the first Boeing 707, and up, through the X-15, and then all, through the space station and everything
And
else. It's
and
just
the
remarkable.
safety culture probably lags behind that innovation and drive as inherent.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you look at aviation safety, such as it was, back in the 30s, and it was much more hazardous than space flight. I think it was pretty
Yeah.
the people that delivered the mail, those airplanes back, and then they were having heavier losses
Right.
than any space program would ever allow. We wouldn't allow that today.
Yeah.
So things have gotten better in the military too. When I was flying the third generation fighters, we were doing better than what happened, during the 40s and 50s. There was the loss rates, during World War II were just, terrible. Not just from combat, you just in training. So we got better and better, and then the fourth and fifth generation fighters now the accident rates get better and better, of course. And the same thing will happen in space. We'll evolve in a similar way, hopefully in the next 100 years. But that when you stand and look back 100 years and then try to say, okay, where we're going to be 100 years from now, you realize how how forward we might be in that next 10 decades.
Well, I think that is probably a good place to leave it. Terry Hart,
Good.
former astronaut, mission specialist on Challenger, professor at Lehigh, and operator of that IMAX camera on that 1984 STS 41C flight. So thank you
Thank you.
again so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you, David. Nice to be with you.